Although most people are quite happy to paint the inside of their house, tackling the job room by room, I think it's quite another matter when it comes to the outside, especially where large walls are involved. Now, the reason for this probably is twofold. First of all, where do you start? And secondly, the sheer size of the job. Now, I think the best way to understand this is to see how a professional would tackle it, like Chris Ruff here. Now, Chris, you must have tackled almost every type of job outside. Would you say it's that much more difficult?
Oh, I think most painting jobs are basically the same, as long as you work to a logical system. And that's, you know, you must start by going around to the job and having a look at the work, inspecting it thoroughly. Take a typical job I did recently, a semi-detached house on the outskirts of London. The first thing I noticed when I went onto the job, I saw grass growing from the gutters. There's quite a bit of sand in the gutters as well, that had come from the tiles. One or two gutter joints that needed remaking.
Now, obviously, you'd always start at the top.
Of course, whether it's the inspection, preparation, or painting, you must work to a logical system. Inspect the guttering and pipes first, then the woodwork, then the masonry and walls.
And you're looking for anything that's defective, quite apart from paint.
That's right, guttering, pipes, window frames, doors, any item that might have to be replaced. And you've got to make sure you order them plenty of time before you start work. And if there are any repairs to do, get them out of the way in plenty of time. At this house, the woodwork was fairly sound, but the putties were very poor, and the paintwork was blistering and flaking and was in need of burning off.
What about the condition of the walls?
Well, fairly sound, but very powdery, and there were patches of algae on some of the walls.
So there are three things you've really got to look for. First of all, is the old coating powdery? Secondly, are there any large cracks which have got to be filled? And thirdly, are there any growths which have got to be treated? For instance, on the north wall or under trees, you might find areas of green algae, or there could be other forms of growth. So all these must be removed before painting the walls.
Here I'm making a rough measurement of the window opening and door openings, so I can take these away from the overall measurement of the house to give me my yardage for quantities.
Now, it's all right for Chris here. I mean, his experience tells him exactly how much materials that he'll require. But I would recommend that you spend a fair bit of time in taking your measurements. In fact, why not consult the paint manufacturer's literature, because this will tell you the average spreading rate for materials, and this will all help you to calculate the correct quantities that you'll require for the job. You'll probably be working at the weekend when the shops are closed, so you won't want to run out of material when you're halfway around the wall. And on the other hand, of course, you won't want a lot of material left over when you've finished. So you can see the calculations are important, especially with large wall areas where a fair amount of material is required. Now, Chris, what was on the walls?
Cement paint, overcoated at some time or other with emulsion paint. I was rather worried by the chalky deposits coming off. There were several hair cracks there and one large one I'd spotted. The bottom of the back door was quite rotten. The only answer here was a new door. As I went round the house, I checked the pipework to make sure it was firmly fixed to the walls. I had a good look at the conservatory roof to see whether it was strong enough to take board so that we could reach the work above.
Chris will have made his inspection, and from his notes, he'll prepare the specification and arrive at a price for the job. Now, being a professional, he'll allow for the preparation and for the hidden items that make all the difference between a job that lasts and one that doesn't. Now, if you're doing the job yourself, the labour costs won't apply, but you will want that job to last. So do the same as Chris. Know all about the job before you start. What you will need to do, the materials and equipment that you'll require, how long the job will take, and most important, how much will it cost. If you've got a garden, remember to include all those paintable bits, garden gates, garages, greenhouses, even bicycle lean-tos, because remember, it all adds to the overall appearance of the finished job. The big part of the job is the preparation, and this is something that you just can't skip. So let's see how Chris sets about it. He'll start at the top, and work downwards.
Yes, the first job is to clean out the gutters and check to see they're sound. I'm also preparing the outside, chipping, scraping and wire brushing to remove the loose, flaking paint before spot priming.
In fact, get it all done while you're up the ladder.
Well, not always up the ladder. At this particular house, we couldn't get a ladder around the side. We used an aluminium scaffolding tower, fixing the struts to the scaffold board, which was laid on the garage roof.
These towers can be hired, and of course they're jolly useful, but they do need proper handling, and we'll come back to that later.
If you come across a defective gutter joint, you have to cut through the bolt with a hacksaw, lift the gutter section out of place, clean the joint, put new putty in, squeeze the two together, and put a new bolt through. Of course, you do this before you paint the gutters. By the way, this only applies to asbestos and metal gutters. Plastic ones have built-in gaskets.
I say, those gutter boards look in a poor way.
Actually, they're worse than they are. The gutter's been blocked for a fair length of time, and the water had overflowed and stained the paintwork.
Yes, that's the tricky area behind the gutters, especially with metal gutters, where the corrosion's likely to collect, and of course it's difficult to get at. And I suppose that's really where you score with plastic gutters, because they don't need painting.
These are asbestos. Now they're thoroughly clean. The next job is to line them with a bitumen paint. The important thing here is not to get the bitumen on the outside of the guttering, otherwise this will discolour the paint that goes over the top of it. Many people make the mistake of just painting the outside and leaving the inside. Then the water can seep through the asbestos. You've got to paint it all, and do it properly, and this applies with metal gutters too. Then you go round again spot priming. I'm using an alkali-resisting primer here, as these are asbestos gutters.
Now Chris has moved on to the woodwork, and let's watch him burning off. Burning the paint until it blisters, and then moving the flame across to another area of the paintwork before the timber has a chance to scorch. That's the art of burning off, because once you scorch the timber, you're back to a bad surface again. And nothing is more important than having a really good surface before you start to paint. And if you do have to burn off under the eaves, be really careful, because it's so easy to start a fire without even knowing it. Now back to the walls again.
To remove the loose and flaking material from the cement rendering, I scraped it roughly first, then gave it a good brushing. At this stage, any cracks can be cut out with a stripping knife.
Ah, now I see you're knotting. Now tell us something about that.
Well, the main thing is this. You must cover the knot with a coat of shellac knotting. In most cases, it will reduce the risk of traces of resin bleeding from the knot and staining the paint. The black on the soffits was some form of bitumen, which would also bleed through. So I'm using an aluminium sealer. This will also seal the knots.
Now, let's move on to the priming stage. Are you using a white lead priming for this?
No, I'm using a lead-free primer. Safer and better.
The one thing, a lot of people don't realise that the rebates ought to be thoroughly primed and allowed to dry hard before reglazing with putty. And the other important thing, of course, is to work the primer well into the end grain of timbers.
That's right. This is where they tend to rot, especially on opening wooden windows.
Yes, it's very true. And, of course, for metal windows, you've got a special putty in any case, haven't you?
Yes, and they're not interchangeable. You must use the right one.
Yes, and in each case, of course, the rebate's thoroughly primed and allowed to dry hard before using the putty.
That's right. Well, this is the time to make good any nail holes, cracks, and any other imperfections in the woodwork. The next job is to treat any remaining algae. I'm using a solution of 1 part of domestic bleach to 4 parts water. I shall let this stay on the wall for 48 hours.
This will kill any growth that Chris was unable to remove when he was brushing down. And while it works, of course, it will enable him to get onto the other odds and ends, like gates and garage doors.
Well, these surfaces weren't too bad, really. I washed down with water and detergent solution, stripped the flaking in defective areas, rubbed down, not any bare knots, and then prime.
Again, working the primer well into the end grain and the cracks.
This is very important. And any metal work is primed with a metal primer. Then the necessary making good, stopping up the cracks and the holes. And when this is dried, a coat of undercoat over the lot, and you're ready for the gloss. Back on the walls, the bleach solution has done its job, and the dead algae has been washed off, but the walls are still powdery and need sealing down. Here I'm using a special oil-bound masonry sealer.
Notice that Chris is using a brush to get the sealer well into the surface.
Yes, I'm really pushing the sealer into any cracks. This particular crack was one of the largest. It was loose and powdery, and before it was filled, I made sure the sandy material was bound down with the sealer.
What are you filling the cracks with, Chris? The usual sand and cement?
Yes, that's okay for any large cracks and general making good, but you need something much finer for the hair cracks. I'm trying out a new oil filler, but you know these special wall paints will hide most of the fine cracks anyway.
So then, the preparation is by far the biggest part of outside painting. And as Chris said, it's just no good trying to skimp it. And now to the final painting. And we start straight away with the tricky bit, cutting in. And I can see you keep changing your grip.
Well, you have to. You hold the brush on its side and you gradually push it up to the object you're cutting into. You don't go straight to the line. You move the brush in slowly. The answer here is to use a fairly small brush. I'm using a 4-inch, but the layman would do better with a 3 or even a 2-inch.
Yes, but with plenty of paint on it.
Yes, you need a fairly well-charged brush, full of paint.
Now, once you've completed all the cutting in around the brickwork, I suppose you can apply the paint to the larger areas by roller.
Yes, that's right. You can't beat a roller for getting over the large, smooth surfaces quickly.
Any tips you can pass on?
Yes, you want a roller well-charged, but not with too much paint on it. Otherwise, you're going to spatter yourself with paint. You spread the paint evenly in all directions, laying off, or rather rolling off, in one direction.
So that roller bucket looks a good idea. I suppose you can hire these, but they can't be that expensive to buy.
Well, be lost without mine. Like my long arm roller, it saved me a hell of a lot of time climbing up and down steps.
So the masonry paint's on, and now we come on to putting the first coat of gloss onto the woodwork. Now, this can be a particularly tricky undertaking for the layman, I think, when it comes to window frames, especially if he's perched on top of a ladder. Now, you've learnt the art of not getting it all over the windows, but not everybody's as experienced as you, Chris.
Well, I think you've got to work to a system here again. Start at the top of the window, take a pane at a time, use a 1-inch brush that's fairly worn, fairly well charged with paint, and as I said before, don't go straight to the line you're cutting into. Take the well-charged brush, put it on the job, and work it to the line slowly.
I think there's a lot of people who don't realise that you should let the paint run onto the glass, say up to 1/8 of an inch, to seal over the putty, because I've seen several people trying to cut gingerly down the line of the putty and sort of missing in places, and then you get condensation inside or rain running down outside, getting down underneath and pulling the whole of the paint off again. This is important, isn't it, Chris?
It's quite right. You must cut in onto the glass.
Now, that's all right for you and I, Chris, who have had a bit of experience and got a fairly steady hand. The layman, I suppose, could use one of these guards, but then you've got to get the hang of using those so you can get paint underneath and make a mess on the glass. I've often been asked whether you can put tape on the glass. Well, I suppose the answer is yes, providing that you don't let the paint dry really hard, because if you pull off the tape then, chances are you'll pull the paint with it. So I wouldn't like to guarantee that one at all. I think you've got the only answer really, Chris, and that's a 1-inch brush, fairly well worn, charged with paint, and a steady hand. There's no other way. So why don't you have a go, and if you make an uneven line, well, let the paint dry hard, and then just trim it back with a razor blade later. Now, usually the last job of all is the front door, and that really does have to take a close examination, doesn't it?
Well, it's not all that difficult to get a high-class job if you do the job in the right order. Open the door and paint the edge that faces outwards. Then, cut in the glazing bars with an inch brush, keeping the paint off the face of the door. Cut round the mouldings and fill in the panels one at a time. Next you do the top and middle cross rails and finish off with the upright stiles, leaving the bottom rail until last, just in case dirt gets picked up from the bottom edge of the door where it's difficult to clean.
Now, Chris has shown us how a good professional paints the outside. There are no shortcuts. Plan it properly and don't skimp the preparation. Make sure that you set a realistic time for the job, because now Chris has taken about a week to complete the outside of the house. So you've really got to be prepared to take a week's holiday or several evenings or weekends. And if you're not prepared to devote that sort of time to it, well then just take one elevation at a time and do that thoroughly. Now, Chris, when's the best time to do this?
Well, I can't pick and choose.
No, of course you can't.
But ideally, after a long dry spell, when the woodwork and the walls have time to dry out, preferably in the summer.
With the long hours of daylight.
That's right.
Now, it's best to plan the job in plenty of time, especially if you've got to hire equipment, because you won't want that hanging around the house for days on end. And in any case, you may well have to order this well in advance. Plan the job properly and you'll find that painting the outside is just like any other paint job. But before you start, a few words of advice. Remember, however important a job is, it's never as important as you are. So always work from a comfortable, secure position. Never risk overreaching. Make sure your ladders are safe and are long enough for the job. Most important, pack them securely on the ground using boards and not bricks or tiles which might crumble. Wherever you can, try and lash your ladder, especially at the top. And another important thing is the angle of pitch of the ladder. And a good rule of thumb for this is 1 foot out for every 4 foot up. Now, if you're using a scaffold tower, get somebody to help you put it up and to pull it down. And when you're using scaffold boards between trestles, don't trust one single board because it's far too springy. Always wear a good sound pair of shoes, a pair that are not slippery. And never put your eyes at risk from splashes and flakes. In fact, it's not a bad idea to wear a pair of goggles or even sunglasses for this. And when you're burning off, just mind where you're pointing that flame, because on some of these gas burners, the flames are rather difficult to see. And remember, when you turn them off, some have to be turned off at the cylinder and not just at the gun. So it's all just common sense, really. By the way, Chris, did they like the job you did?
Like it? I'm now doing the house.